Welcome to the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show. Today is March 25th, 2021. My name is Andy Zee. I'm the host of the show, and I'm coming to you from Los Angeles, California. This is one sick country. The last 10 days, 2 weeks have brought that home in a punch-in-the-gut kind of way. Just this week in Boulder, Colorado, 10 people gunned down in a grocery store by a reportedly mentally ill young man just a few years out of high school. Atlanta, Georgia, 10 days before, 8 people shot in 3 massage parlors, 6 of them immigrant Asian women. The initial reports of a motive indicate that the shooter committed this horrific slaughter to resist, quote, sexual temptation. Revcom.us, the website with which we produce this RNL show, wrote this, quote, "This act of mass murder struck further terror into the hearts of Asian people, immigrants and those born here alike, who already faced an escalating wave of bigotry and violence, stoked in large part by the open racism and xenophobia of the Trump-Pence fascist regime. And the view of women as objects of sexual temptation that must be controlled and even outright exterminated echoed thousands of years of religious shame, blame, and violent control over women's bodies and sexuality at the hands of men and patriarchal institutions." Revcom.us went on to say that the oppression of women and the mentality of white supremacy are not once-in-a-while things in America. They have been deeply woven into the historic fabric and daily life of the U.S. society and are integral to the functioning of the capitalist imperialist system that defines it, end quote. Later in the show, my co-host Sunsara Taylor will be introducing a segment that powerfully responds to this kind of femicide, the killing of women, in a way that both brings that right into your gut, but it's also uplifting. Stay tuned for that. It's really going to be an uplifting part of today's program. Also, running through the last 10 days has been the story of the beginning of the trial of Derek Chauvin, the Minneapolis cop who last May kneeled on the neck of George Floyd, a black man. Kneeled until he drove the breath out of George Floyd while people begged him to stop. This ignited a rebellion followed by one of the largest protests in U.S. history. This tapped into a running sore, the legacy of the theft of Africans, the Middle Passage, slavery and slave catchers, the lynching of the Klan, Jim Crow segregation, and the new Jim Crow that warehouses millions of Black and Latino youth in the prisons of this country today as they are subjected to daily violence from the police, and hundreds are murdered every year by the police of this country and of this system. And there is another story, a story that is not yet well known, except for the viewers of the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show, a story that this show is a part of. And that is the story of a leader and a movement for an actual revolution here in this country, a country that is the source of so much oppression in the world today. This is a developing story, a breaking story that together with you, the viewers of this show, that we are writing. The breaking news that we are working to break out of the shadows with a movement to overthrow this system. The brutal horrors of which I've spoken already are just the tip of the iceberg of what this system does. They are concentrated expressions of the oppressive and exploitative system of capitalism and imperialism that currently enslaves humanity here and around the world. But the truth is, this is not just a story, a narrative that we tell. It is the reality of the solution to the oppression and exploitation that humanity faces here and around the world. It's what we here at the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show are working towards. What is happening beneath the surface is that there is a leader, a leadership, and a way out of the madness, a solution through an actual revolution to bring about a radically new and far better world. This is real. It's not our preferred narrative. It's not our identity. It's not a marketing slogan to come up with a clever name for a YouTube show. Revolution is possible. And there is this extraordinary leadership in Bob Avakian who is ready to lead you. This is a movement that is forming It is organizing revolution clubs around the country, and you can organize one in your area. Go to revcom.us to find out about these clubs, what they're all about, what we call the 526. Go on revcom.us to find out what that is, or tune into the last two shows where I discuss that. The RNL show is a show that kicks the real deal, a scientific way to know and change the world, a way that is the method and approach of the new communism that's been developed by Bob Avakian. So in just a moment today, we're going to bring you a segment from a very important talk that Bob Avakian gave in 2018, why we need an actual revolution and how we could really make revolution. And then we're going to continue a series that we're doing based on the article on revcom.us, Bob Avakian for the Liberation of Black People and the Emancipation of All Humanity, that goes into how his life's work, a big part of his motivation and the impulse and the continued drive of his work and who he is, has been his involvement with the struggle to liberate Black people in this country, and how that's connected up with making a total revolution in this country as the only way that Black people can get free. And this is going to be followed by a really deep discussion with Carl Dix, who became a follower of Bob Avakian when he got out of Leavenworth prison for refusing to go fight in Vietnam. But first, as an introduction to today's episode of the Revolution Nothing Less show, I want to read to you 2 points of basic orientation that are on the website revcom.us. 1. This system of capitalism imperialism is the source of endless horrors for the majority of people in this country and all around the world, and it is increasingly threatening the very existence of humanity. We are actively working for an actual revolution to bring down, to overthrow, and to completely abolish this whole system as soon as possible and replace it with something radically different and much better, a new society built on a totally different foundation. That and nothing else is what's needed. So that is what we are all about. And we have the necessary scientific method, the plan, the strategy, and the leadership to succeed in this. But there aren't enough people committed to this yet. So this is what you need to be about. Anything else will completely fail to deal with the root of all the problems or lead to an actual solution. Given the situation facing humanity, we don't have time to waste. So we need to get busy working for this revolution in an organized way and winning more and more people to do the same. 2, we are followers of BA, and you need to become followers of BA too. He is an old white guy, yes. Deal with it. He's providing ongoing leadership for the revolution, and he has a whole body of work that contains the scientific method to analyze the problem and solution, the strategy for revolution to bring down this system, and the vision and concrete plan for that radically different and much better society on the road to emancipate all of humanity from every form of oppression and exploitation, and to enable humanity to become fit caretakers of the earth. He's even written a constitution that concretely maps out what to do starting right after the seizure of power so we can actually work on building up that whole new emancipating society. There has never been a leader like this in this country, and there is no other leader like this in the world now. We cannot afford not to follow this leadership if we ever want to get free and put an end to this madness, end quote. So take that orientation and run with it. If you met the revolution 24 minutes ago when you heard about this show and you're watching for the first time, run with this orientation. If you met the revolution 24 hours ago out on the street and they told you to watch this show, run with this orientation. If you met the revolution 24 years ago or 2 times 24 years ago, and you've been part of this movement, run with this orientation. Go and struggle with your friends, your families, and strangers. Connect up with the revolution at revcom.us and on our social media. We need to go work to prepare today for the one thing that could lift a burden on the 7 billion people on this planet, and that is to make an actual revolution. Right now, the movement for an actual revolution is focused on the New Year's statement from Bob Avakian, a new year, the urgent need for a radically new world for the emancipation of all humanity. You can read that on revcom.us. But let's start off today's episode with this segment that I talked to you about before, from why we need an actual revolution, how we could really make a revolution. And this segment begins with what you can do to start.
So let's get deeper into what we need to do now. Let's go back to the crucial point that we need to be serious and scientific. A scientific approach and method leads to the understanding that the basis for revolution lies not in what most people are thinking or doing right now or at any given time, but in the deep and defining contradictions of the system. What is concentrated in the 5 stops and all the terrible suffering to which this system subjects millions and billions of people, which cannot be eliminated within this system. But this revolution will not be brought about magically or just by the way this system causes people to suffer. This revolution must be consciously and systematically built for, from here forward, with ever-growing numbers of people, first in the thousands and ultimately in the millions, who are brought forward into the organized ranks of the revolution to actively work for this revolution. How we can win lays out the plan and the means for how we can make this real. First, it is important to understand that although it is true, as I have said in the New Communism, that revolution cannot and will not be made just by spreading the idea of revolution around and perhaps getting some positive responses, thumbs up. At the same time, however, it is also true that spreading the word about this revolution can itself be very important revolutionary work, an important part of building the movement for revolution. The fact is that among those who really need to know about this, including those who most desperately need this revolution, very few have even heard about it. And they are living with the belief that this world as it is the only one that's possible. And for many, this means that on top of being subjected to continual brutality, degradation, and torment, they are suffocated by the lack of hope. Raising people's sights to the possibility of a radically different world can not only bring hope to people on a scientific basis, but can also awaken a potentially powerful force for the revolution that could make this hope a reality. For these reasons, we need to be on a mission to spread the word, to let people know that we have the leadership, the science, the strategy and program, and the basis for organizing people for an actual emancipating revolution. Here again is the importance of the point I emphasized earlier about the great strengths we do have and what is still missing. Masses of people who catch the worst hell under this system and those who were sickened by the endless outrages perpetrated by this system, who need to be brought forward wave after wave and develop into conscious revolutionaries and revolutionary leaders. Spreading the word, particularly as this is done together with others in a planned, systematic way, can be an important step in joining the organized ranks of the revolution and taking part in the process of building the revolution. A crucial next step in making this revolution real is that thousands need to get organized into the ranks of the revolution now, while millions are being influenced in favor of this revolution. Getting organized into the ranks of the revolution means acting together with others in a unified way, as an organized force, guided by the strategic plan and leadership for the revolution, building the revolution among broader masses of people, while also getting deeper into the principles, methods, and goals of this revolution, the basics of which are concentrated in the points of attention for the revolution. A key form of revolutionary organization are the revolution clubs, which live by, propagate, and fight for those points of attention. The core of the revolution clubs are people deeply committed to revolution who closely follow the leadership of the Revolutionary Communist Party, which has the basis in the new communism to provide overall leadership for the revolution. But the revolution clubs also need to reach out to and involve growing numbers of people who are new to the revolution. The revolution clubs are a means through which people can take part in and powerfully represent for the revolution in an organized way as they learn more about the revolution and advance toward joining the party. Networks of people working together to spread the word about and organize people into the revolution need to be built and expanded in all parts of the country and linked together. In areas where the party and the revolution clubs have not yet established an organized presence, or in circumstances where people have not yet come into direct contact with this organized presence of the revolution, but have become aware of the core principles and goals of the revolution, they should reach out to and involve others they can draw forward around those core principles and goals. They should link up with the central leadership of the revolution for assistance and direction in organizing a revolution club among the people they are bringing into the revolution, on the basis of the points of attention for the revolution, which are included in the pamphlet, How We Can Win, and are posted at revcom.us. A crucial connecting link in all this is the party's website, revcom.us, and newspaper, Revolution, which sharply expose the crimes of this system, scientifically analyze why it cannot be reformed, and give guidance and direction for people to work in a unified way for the revolution. In everything we do, it needs to be kept clearly in mind and boldly put forward to people that whatever part of the country we are in, and whatever the size of our forces at any given time, we are doing all this as part of a national movement, together with people in other parts of the country, aiming to impact all of society and building a revolution to overthrow the whole system with the whole world in mind. An important principle and method in organizing people into the revolution is the understanding that while revolution requires serious commitment, people's level of commitment will, at any given time, essentially correspond to and be grounded in what aspirations have been awakened or brought forward in them, and what they are coming to understand is required in relation to that. And this commitment should proceed from what people themselves have been won, yes, through struggle, even at times sharp struggle, to see as a necessary and essential contribution to the revolution. People can start with basic tasks that they can readily carry out and feel confident doing, which make a real contribution to building the revolution. And they can learn to take on more responsibility as they gain more experience and a deeper understanding. The important thing is that they are part of the process of building the revolution, together with others. These principles and methods should be kept clearly in mind and applied at all stages of people's involvement with the revolution, to enable them to continue in advancing in understanding and commitment.
So that was Bob Avakian from his talk, Why We Need an Actual Revolution, How We Could Really Make Revolution. I'm here with Sunsara Taylor, my co-host. Welcome. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Andy. Good to be here.
Okay, we have a big show today, and Sunsara is going to tell you about the next segment.
So we want to go right into what really is going to be a very substantive and meaty 2 segments, in fact. We've been serializing here at the Revolution Nothing Less show, piece by piece, this important article that's on the website, revcom.us. Andy mentioned it earlier. Bob Avakian, For the Liberation of Black People and the Emancipation of All of Humanity. Today, we're going to bring you part 3 of this installment of this article. And you could go back and see the part 1 and 2 in previous episodes. And that's going to be followed by a really rich interview. Lenny Wolff, who is a leader in the Get Organized for an Actual Revolution tour and a writer for the revcom.us website, is helping us out here on the Revolution Nothing Less show. He's leading this interview with Carl Dix, who is going to bring alive a lot of his experience going through the very period that's covered in this article that we're bringing you today. Carl Dix is going to share some of his experience coming out of Leavenworth Military Prison after refusing to fight in Vietnam and encountering Bob Avakian's work, first in writing and then in person. It's a very rich story. We're going to bring it to you, and it comes right up to today. So stay with it. That's coming next.
The end of segment 2, which told of Bob Avakian's early years and his work with the Black Panther Party, concluded with this. By the beginning of the 1970s, millions of people in this country were in favor of some kind of revolutionary change, but they faced profound challenges. How could this revolution be made? Or was it even possible to make a revolution here, up against such powerful forces of oppression and repression? Which were the key forces that had to be mobilized to have a real chance to carry out such a revolution? What kind of leadership was needed? And what methods and approaches should that leadership be based on? The difficulties in confronting and seeking the answers to these hard questions, combined with brutal and often murderous repression by the powers that be, led many revolutionary organizations, including the Black Panther Party, to split and end up departing from the road that could lead to real revolution. By this time, partly because of the influence of the Black Panther Party, which had popularized the Red Book of quotations from the Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong, BA had become convinced not only that revolution was necessary and was possible, but it had to be led by a vanguard force that based itself on the scientific method and approach of communism, as it had been developed initially by Karl Marx, then further developed by Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Russian Revolution in the early part of the 20th century, and then in turn further developed by Mao, who led the Chinese Revolution and the new socialist society in China until his death in 1976. BA led in the formation of the Revolutionary Union at the end of the 1960s, with the aim of working toward the establishment of the vanguard party of revolution, based on the science of communism. During the first part of the 1970s, BA was both the practical leader and the leading theoretician of the Revolutionary Union, writing much of the essays and polemics for its theoretical journal, Red Papers. This included major articles, particularly in Red Papers 5 and 6, that involved groundbreaking, scientific, materialist analysis of the situation of Black people, historically and down to the present. How and why their particular conditions of oppression had changed, from the time of slavery to the present era, and how this objectively put Black people in a potentially powerful position to be a driving force, not only for their own liberation, but for the communist revolution, whose fundamental aim is the abolition of all oppression and exploitation. These articles included powerful polemics, arguing against positions and programs that would not lead to, but would actually work against, this liberation and the revolutionary transformation of the world as a whole.
So when I went to prison, I started reading some of the literature. People started struggling with me in prison. People were struggling with me about, hey, if you really like serious, you got to read this. And the first thing they had me to read was red paper. I knew BA had wrote. I had to read red paper 5 and 6. Because both of those was about the black national question. I had to read it. And I had already read, I had studied, listened to Malcolm X. Malcolm X, all his recordings over and over. I had read Franz Fanon, Wretched of the Earth. I had read all the stuff from like the Panthers and the Panthers leaders and stuff about this. Contradict this question, this black national question, and what's the solution? But when I read red papers, I had to acknowledge I'd never seen this kind of approach, the kind of approach that he took to analyze from the time of slavery to what happened after slavery with Jim Crow to what was going on like now with, coming into the cities, into the proletariat and the implications of all that for revolution, that it was even black people being in even a more powerful position to contribute to revolution, communist revolution and stuff objectively. I had never read anything like that.
In 1975, with BA's leadership, the Revolutionary Communist Party was founded, with the aim of being the vanguard force for the revolution that was and continues to be profoundly necessary. Over the decades since then, BA has fought to keep that party on the revolutionary road and to bring forward new revolutionary forces to revitalize and strengthen the vanguard forces for the revolution that is now all the more urgently required. While continuing to provide practical guidance to the revolutionary forces, BA, through summing up the experience, positive and negative, of the communist movement, and drawing from a broad range of human experience, has brought forward a new synthesis of communism, also referred to as the New Communism, which most decisively has established communism on an even more consistently scientific basis. As BA's official biography explains, the New Communism is a continuation of, but also represents a qualitative leap beyond, and in some important ways a break with, communist theory as it had been previously developed. It provides the basis, the science, the strategy, and the leadership for an actual revolution in a radically new society on the road to real emancipation. A defining part of this new communism is the emphasis it gives to the struggle for the liberation of Black people and the relation of this to the ending of all oppression. And this has continued to stand out in BA's leadership role and work over the decades up to the present. At revcom.us, there is a special section, Bob Avakian on the oppression of Black people and the revolutionary struggle to end all oppression, which contains clips from films and selections from the writings of BA on this question. The following are just a few examples of important works and leadership by Bob Avakian over the past few decades that speak to this decisive question. The book Reflections, Sketches, and Provocations, written by Bob Avakian during the 1980s, contains a number of commentaries speaking in a number of dimensions to the oppression of Black people and the struggle against this oppression, including support for rebellions following the murder of Black people by police.
A night of mayhem in Miami has been followed by a day of more tension and more trouble.
The violence broke out after a white male jury in Tampa found 4 white former Dade County policemen innocent in the death of Black Miami businessman Arthur McDuffie.
This book begins with the essay, Hill Street Bullshit, Richard Pryor Routines, and the Real Deal, which powerfully exposes how terror against Black people and other oppressed people is part of the job of the police.
I'm the police! I run shit here! You just live here!
And is a reward for carrying out the role of maintaining the law and order that keeps the oppressed in their desperate and miserable conditions.
To get another real look at what kind of society, what kind of system this is in the United States today, think about what happened to Amadou Diallo in New York. Now, Richard Pryor used to have this routine he did to show what it was like for a black man just in an ordinary encounter with the police. How you had to try to avoid being one of those mistakes where you got killed. He talked about a black man gets pulled over by the police and he has to say, I am reaching into my pocket for my license because I don't want to be no motherfucking accident.
I am reaching into my pocket for my license. Because I don't want to be no motherfucking accident.
You have to show them and make clear and loud that you're going into your pocket to bring out your wallet. Otherwise, they'll say you had a gun and shoot you down. And for Amadou Diallo, even that didn't work. Amadou Diallo pulled out his wallet and held it up, and they shot him down anyway. 41 times they shot at him. They pumped his body with bullets.
Going deeper, it speaks to how this is rooted in this system of capitalism imperialism, which has this oppression built into it from the very beginning. In the 1990s, BA raised the idea that there should be a day every year when people mobilize to protest police brutality, mass incarceration, and the repression by the government. This proposal was taken up in a broad coalition, including family members of people killed by police, was formed to initiate in 1996 the National Day of Protest to stop police brutality, repression, and the criminalization of a generation. At its height, over the next decade, this National Day of Protest, held every October 22nd, rallied thousands of people in dozens of cities across the country. And activities by people who have been part of this coalition have continued since then.
Hi, I'm Lenny Wolff, and I'm going to be talking with Carl Dix and responding to some of the segment that we just heard on Bob Avakian for the liberation of black people and the emancipation of all humanity. So Carl Dix, welcome to Revolution Nothing Less, and let's get into this.
It's good to be talking with you and great to be on the Revolution Nothing Less show.
Okay, I think it would be good. Why don't you let our listeners know, how did you become a revolutionary?
Okay, I'll give you the more condensed version.
Okay.
I mean, look, I was a young black man, late 60s, going into the 70s. I saw what was happening to black people here in this country. And at the same time, the Vietnam War was hanging over everything, including the fact that I was draft eligible. In fact, I drafted into the military. So I end up in the military in the late 60s, not able to be right in the forefront of everything that was going on, but watching it, and then getting orders to go to Vietnam right at the height of things in like 1969. And while I was home on leave, they murdered Fred Hampton in his bed. And I've got orders to go to Vietnam, and I look at what went down, and I said, that was a search and destroy mission in the ghetto in Chicago. And the search and destroy mission was the form that a lot of the military activity that the US engaged in Vietnam, where they'd set somebody up as a target and they'd come at them middle of the night like that and take them out. And it's like, they're sending me to be a part of doing that to the Vietnamese people while they're doing it to black freedom fighters here in this country. And that got me to thinking, well, where do I stand in this? Can I go and be a part of this US attempt to crush the Vietnamese liberation struggle, which is something I learned very clearly that's what they were doing, because I talked to a lot of GIs who had been over to the Nam before, got their take on it. I talked to a lot of people in the anti-war movement, and I decided I can't go. I ended up refusing going to Vietnam. ending up in Leavenworth Military Penitentiary, ending up spending most of my time in Leavenworth in solitary because I was organizing resistance inside the prison. And one thing that solitary did for me is it gave me time to do a lot of reading, and we were able to get some radical and revolutionary literature into the prison. And while there, I was reading things like the red papers from the Revolutionary Union. And that's where I first encountered Bob Avakian in some of the early editions of the red papers. We were getting the Young Lords Party paper. We got Marx, things from Marx and Lenin. And it really struck me that this world was a hell of a mess. You know, wars in Vietnam, spreading to Laos and Cambodia, what was happening to Black people, what was happening to the Palestinians, and more. And the argument that people like the Black Panthers were making, that this is all part of a system, and that the solution to these problems was to make revolution to get rid of that system, was resonating with me. And in some of the works of Marx and Lenin, I got fired with this sense of what kind of revolution, and that it wasn't just let's get some new people in power and hope that they would do better than the old ones, but that this was a revolution was possible that could uproot all of the exploitation and oppression that people face around the world, and that there was an understanding to lead that revolution.
I think it's really brings to life, and it's very interesting to hear how the changes you went through to get to where you were then when you were looking for revolutionary organization, and you found one. What happened with you? What was your story there? What were the issues, and what happened with you?
What was going on was struggle erupted around the question of leadership for the revolution. And fundamentally, where it was coming from was what was going to be the relationship between the struggles of oppressed national groupings like the oppressed Black nation in the country, the oppressed Puerto Ricans and other oppressed nationalities, to the overall revolutionary struggle to overthrow US imperialism, to get rid of it as part of emancipating humanity. And a view that arose was that to make this revolution, the leadership for it and the leader of the Revolutionary Communist Party could not be a white person. It had to be either a Black person. Some people argued it had to be a Black person. Other people said, well, Black, Puerto Rican, as long as it's a person of color, an oppressed nationality, that'd be okay. And the thinking and understanding behind that was that in order to make sure that the revolution aimed at uprooting the oppression of Black people and other oppressed nationalities, it had to be someone from that grouping, because someone white could not be trusted to follow through on that. And that would set us up for the revolution changing some things, but keeping the oppression of Black people and other groups. So that was a question that was up for struggle. And at the time, I was on the wrong side of some of those questions, because I was one of the people who was arguing, but we can't have a white person lead this. How can we trust that they'd really fight to end the oppression of Black people? I was more broad-minded because I said it could either be a Black or a Puerto Rican. Some of the other people were saying, no, it had to be somebody Black. At the time that this was going on, I just happened to be in New York City and needed somewhere to stay. And someone from the Revolutionary Union was going to hook me up with somewhere to stay. And when they did it, it turned out to be the same place that Bob Avakian happened to be. So I get there, I find out that he's there, and he says to me, Carl, are you open to discussing some of the differences that exist between our groups. And my take was, okay, we've got disagreements. Let's talk about them. Let's struggle over them because we're out to make revolution. And let's go for what's correct and what's incorrect and apply the scientific understanding of communism to those differences and see where we can get to. And that's something that to me is real important. People have to actually look at differences as not the reason to have nothing to do with each other, but let's actually go to what the reality is. What are the obstacles we're up against? And how are we going to overcome them? How are we going to transform that reality to end the oppression and exploitation that people are up against? And it was early in the evening when we started talking. And as the discussion went on, we ended up talking all night long. I mean, I'm not kidding you. We're still struggling, conversating, discussing, finding some unity, going farther. And then at a certain point, the sun comes up. And the thing about this was, it started out, we were bumping heads. I was arguing for Black workers take the lead as the way to move the struggle forward. I was arguing that given the history of the United States, we could not have a revolutionary vanguard that could be trusted to make the kind of revolution that was needed if it was led by a white person. And the discussion over that point in particular was very instructive for how our discussion moved that night, but also instructive for the way in which Bob Avakian goes about leading the process of making revolution and resolving contradiction in relation to that. Because we talked about it, and on the one hand, I put out like, well, we can't have a white person lead this new Communist Party because we can't be sure that it would go forward and take care of all the oppression that needed to be taken care of. So then he asked me, well, what are the criteria for this leadership? And I said, well, you got to have somebody who has a good understanding of the science of revolution and has a demonstrated ability to apply that scientific understanding of revolution to the reality that we face. And as we went on, he added in that they needed to be able to lead others in doing that. It wasn't just that they needed to be good at it themselves, but they needed to be able to bring other people into that process. And he linked that to the kind of revolution we're trying to make isn't one where we need people who can blindly follow, but people who actually understand what we're trying to do and can consciously take it up and lead others in doing it. And that reminded me of some of what appealed to me about Marx's work in terms of how the communist revolution was actually a project of self-emancipation of the working class and humanity. So then we went along that and we had some agreement there. He did take it a little farther than me because I said the person had to be good. And he said, well, if we're talking about the leader of the vanguard party that's going to lead the revolution, shouldn't it be the person who has the best understanding and the best ability to apply that understanding to the reality that we're up against? And I said, yeah, you're right about that. And then he said, okay, now let's go back to what you said about the nationality was crucial. Is that in contradiction to going for the best understanding? And I realized, okay, you're right. There's a contradiction in there, and that the leadership needs to be based on an understanding of the kind of revolution that we're trying to make and what that meant for how we should go about it, and that can't be tied to nationality. Because if you tie it to, well, first and foremost, they can't be white, then you're actually throwing aside the best understanding criteria. And through the course of this discussion and struggle, one thing that he did which initially kind of got under my skin, was at different points where we were differing over things, he would say, well, let's look at this question from the perspective of the future world that we're trying to bring into being. And from that perspective, let's talk about this. And I'm like, why is he keep doing that? But then after he had done it about 8 times, because I was kind of stubborn, I realized he actually meant it. That the way in which we should go about evaluating the reality that we're up against, the contradictions that we face in that reality, the obstacles that we had to get over, and the opportunities to go at those to transform them, needed to be not from the perspective of we're stuck in this right now and how do we get over it, but from the perspective of where we're trying to get to. And that's what he kept applying in the struggle that we were having. And I realized that's a communist approach to it. That's a revolutionary scientific approach to how you do that. Where you're going actually does dictate what you should do now. Because if you act now with no perspective on where you're going to, you could end up taking yourself out of the game in terms of going forward to make revolution. And then and I finally said to him, I understand now why you're saying that. And I think this is how we have to keep going at it. And I have to say, in retrospect, I appreciate the fact that you kept bringing me to that when I was going somewhere else. And we also, because we talked hours and hours, we talked about the relationship of the struggle to liberate Black people from the oppression they faced to the overall revolutionary struggle. We went at it from a historical perspective because both of us had looked into the history of the revolution in Russia and the relationship of the struggle of the oppressed nationalities that were in the prison house of nations that the Russian Empire was, to the struggle to overthrow that empire, and compared that to the relationship between the struggle of Black people and the overall revolutionary struggle in this country. And this is another thing that struck me. He wasn't just standing on the things that had been written down by Lenin or other leaders earlier in the revolutionary movement. He was upholding the correct principles in that, but he was applying them to the actual situation and the reality and how it had changed. Because in Russia, when they were dealing with it there, in the main, the oppressed nationalities were small farmers or peasants. And that actually gave you one situation for how the revolutionary movement had to go to unleash them, to unite them, to be part of the overall movement for revolution. Here in this country, he pointed out that Black people used to be sharecroppers and small farmers in the South, but that by now, in the 1970s, most Black people, many of them were still in the South, but they weren't, sharecropping on somebody's plantation. They were in cities like Atlanta, Wilmington, Birmingham, Jackson, in Mississippi, working in factories and working in factories all around the country. And that didn't mean that Black people were no longer oppressed as a people, but that they were part of the single multinational working class here in this country. And that actually put them in a more powerful position to play a role in making revolution. But that role in making revolution had to be one that they carried out as people who had a full understanding, a revolutionary communist understanding of what needed to be done. And then from that basis, we went back to the Black workers take the lead, because he pointed out to me that what we need to be doing is bringing the understanding of the need for revolution, the possibility of revolution, what kind of revolution it needed to be, to workers in particular and everybody throughout society. And as opposed to, well, Black workers take the lead because Black workers had more of a radical bent coming off of resistance to the oppression of Black people. We need to be raising that understanding among Black workers to the level of being a revolutionary communist understanding, and not just hanging with it where it is and saying, well, they're more radical, they're more ready to move, so let's roll with it. And as we got to the end of this conversation, I had to go back to Baltimore, so we couldn't continue it. It struck me that not only was he right on all of the questions, but that this was a man who could lead a revolution because of the way in which he consistently went to the reality and applied a communist understanding to it, to understand, well, what's the situation that we're in? And he didn't shine on any of the obstacles, but he went at how we overcome them from the perspective of making revolution and bringing a totally different world. And that was actually the kind of understanding we needed to lead this revolution. And also, there was the way in which he called on me to get with that understanding. And here I was, a guy who was in a group that was attacking him, calling him names, you know, like including some unprincipled attacks and just personal attacks, as opposed to raising political differences. But through the whole night, that wasn't what framed the discussion. What framed the discussion is, what are we trying to do? We're trying to make revolution. And if we're united on that, then let's try and figure out how to do that and struggle out our differences in that perspective. And so from there, I was like, okay, the organization I'm in is wrong on these questions. And I have a responsibility to raise struggle in that organization, which I attempted to do. It went nowhere because no one really wanted to listen to it. So that's when I ended up leaving that organization, joining the Revolutionary Union, and becoming a founding member of the Revolutionary Communist Party.
Wow, there is so much in that recounting of that single night, so much concentrated about the method of applying a living science to a living reality, of the approach of coming from the world that's possible, that's very possible, and having a living sense of that possibility, and looking at the, as you put it, what seem like these huge problems today from that vantage point. And then the human being, the principle, and I'm sure you guys probably shared a few laughs along the way after a certain point. It's very, there's a lot to think about, a lot to learn. It's also, quite frankly, very moving story, the way you told that. I want to get into something that's very important and that you have a real big connection to. In the pamphlet that we're discussing today, Bob Avakian for the Liberation of Black People and the Emancipation of All Humanity, after the period in which you're discussing, the pamphlet makes the point that in the 1990s, BA raised the idea that there should be a day every year when people mobilized to protest police brutality, mass incarceration, and repression by the government. This proposal was taken up, and a broad coalition, including family members of people killed by police, was formed to initiate, in 1996, the National Day of Protest to stop police brutality, repression, and the criminalization of a generation. At its height, over the next decade, this National Day of Protest, held every October 22nd, rallied thousands of people in dozens of cities across the country. And activities by people who've been part of this coalition have continued since then. Carl, I'm going to ask you, as somebody who has led that coalition or did lead that coalition for many years, to get some of your thinking on this. But first, I want to play a clip in which BA discusses some of what drives the need to wage this struggle.
In 2012, in Revolution Nothing Less, I talked about the outrageous murder of Ramarley Graham earlier that same year, shot down in his own house in the Bronx by the New York City police. He was only 18 years old. Do I have to tell you what race he was? His mother kept saying, "This has to stop." And his father repeated over and over, "Why did they kill my son? Why did they kill my son?" New York cops then loudly rallied around their fellow pig who murdered Ramarley in cold blood, viciously taunting Ramarley's family and loved ones, demonstrating yet one more time the ugly truth that in the way this country has been built, and for the powers that be in this country, the humanity of Black people has never counted for anything. They have never been valued as human beings, but only as things to be exploited, oppressed, and repressed. 6 years later, and with cold-blooded murders by police continuing in an unbroken chain, I will say again now what I said then. How many more times does this have to happen? How many more times do the tears and the cries of anguish and anger have to pour forth from the wounded hearts of people? How many more times, when another of these outrageous murders is perpetrated by the police, do we have to hear those words that pour gasoline on the already burning wounds? Justifiable homicide, justified use of force by police. How many more?
So, Carl, with that as background, could you give people a sense of what we were doing with October 22nd that year and why that was so important?
I mean, look, the thing about it is he's talking about the murder of one particular Black youth, but then multiply that hundreds of times each and every year. And I've worked with a lot of the family members, mothers and fathers who buried their children whose lives were stolen by these pigs. And it really does come down to this has to stop. And it's a burning reason why we need to make revolution. And it's something that really flows through the work that we did around October 22nd and BA's motivation, Bob Avakian's motivation for proposing that we initiate this day and how we go at it. Because you've got this situation where there's broad sections of young people, especially Black and brown people, this system's got no future for. I walked out of Leavenworth Military Penitentiary, and in a few months, I had a job at a steel mill that was relatively well paid. Today's youth and youth at the time in the 80s and 90s, they couldn't walk into those steel mills and get a job because those steel mills were no longer there. And other factories like that were gone. And what this system had for them was brutal pigs, prisons, and punishment. And we could not allow that section of our base for revolution to be pressed down like that. So Avakian was calling for that. And look, to understand this more, I'm not going to get into it much more, but to understand it more, you need to go to Bob Avakian's New Year statement. A new year, the urgent need for a radically new world, for the emancipation of all of humanity, because he breaks down how that developed specifically among Black people and the way in which large numbers of youth were left with no future under this system. So we had to bring forward resistance around this. We had to do it in a situation where both political parties were competing to be tough on crime. And we had to both rally the people who were under the gun, so to speak, being targeted by all this repression, and also bring to their side broad numbers of people to come together and stand together with these people and build a united fight. You know, religious forces, legal groupings, student groups. We even brought some OGs from various street organizations came into this. This was a very important thing to initiate and to build as part of transforming the situation that we were dealing with, bringing forward potential forces for revolution, building the kind of unity that would be needed to take on the system's attacks today and to get ready and in position when the time was right to make a revolution to overthrow the system. So that's the kind of understanding that was involved in this and the kind of leadership that Bob Avakian brings to it. And, you know, for a lot of people, they're like, yeah, Carl, what you did around that was cool. I really like what you did. Well, the thing you got to get is that, yeah, I was in the forefront of that, but it was the leadership of Bob Avakian, the revolutionary communist scientific approach that he takes and leads the party in taking to deal with the situation we face and to get ready for revolution and in position for revolution. That was what was really driving that. So that's what you have to understand and get at why it came from that and what that means for everything else that we need to do.
So, Carl, one last question. Over the past 5, 7, 8 years, particularly since the killing of Trayvon Martin, and then picking up, young people have gone in the streets, first in the hundreds, then the thousands, most recently last summer in the millions, and have risen up against this police terror and brutality that you were discussing in the previous question, and have demanded an end to white supremacy. What would you say to one of these young people who said to you that they had deep questions about this system and how it gave rise to this horror for 400 years, but that to end this white supremacy, they didn't see how they could follow a white leader like Bob Avakian? What would you say to that to that young woman or man who said that to you?
Well, I guess what I'd say is, look, we got to get serious about this because this is some serious shit that we're dealing with. This is not about representation, about agency, about safe space. This is about what it's going to take to end these horrors once and for all. What kind of leadership do we need? And look, in Bob Avakian, we have the leader that we need to do this. We have a leader who has developed a strategy for how you could make revolution up against all of the shit of the power that they could bring down on us. Check out the speech that he's given on the strategy for revolution up on revcom.us. We have a leader who has authored a constitution for a future socialist republic in North America that breaks down and lays out what the society would be like day one after the revolution. We have a leader who's shown a demonstrated track record to taking on this system, leading others in doing that, and bringing forward and further developing the understanding needed to carry that out. You have somebody who's been motivated to throw his life into this, going back decades, because he feels the way this system weighs down on people, the way that it tries to break them and tries to crush them. But he also feels the potential in the people who are suffering all of this to actually stand up, to actually rise up, and to come to understand and be part of the leaders of making this happen. And when you got a leader like that, you don't say, how old is he? You don't say, is he white or not? You say, is he the leadership that we need to do what's necessary to end all of these horrors? And he is that leader. And look, I've been there. I went into my all-night meeting that we talked about earlier, thinking just what that question that you came out. We need a revolution, but I don't know if a white guy could lead this. And the point as we struggled it out, and what became clear is that the question, if you start out with what's the race, what's the nationality, what's the age, what's the gender, then you're not starting out at the key point. And the key point is who has the understanding to lead this, who is able to apply that understanding to the reality, who's able to lead other people in taking that up, and who's got a demonstrated track record. And that's Bob Avakian. That's why I follow him, and that's why you got to follow him too, if you're serious about ending white supremacy and all these other horrors that the capitalist imperialist system brings down on people.
Carl, I want to thank you for a great interview. And I want to say I really look forward, brother, to seeing you live again and giving you a big hug and standing side by side. Yeah, brother, standing side by side to take on this monster and drive it from the pages of history and bring forward masses to do that. So see you soon.
Okay. I'm waiting for that day too.
In preparation for International Women's Day this year, hundreds of names were painted on the barricades constructed around the National Palace in Mexico. These were the names of women who are victims of femicide, that is, the targeted killing of women because they are women. And in Mexico alone, 10 women a day are killed in this way, murdered by partners, disappeared off the streets, their bodies found mutilated with signs of rape and sexual torture. And Mexico is far from the only place this happens. In El Salvador, Honduras, Chile, Latvia, Canada, South Africa, every country on this planet. Men stalk women, brutalize women, kill women, rape women. This is a mass phenomenon. These men who have had their minds twisted by the society and the culture that we live under. And the very people that women are told to turn to for protection in the face of this, the military and the police, are made up of men who concentrate even higher levels of violence against women. Why? Because these institutions are a concentration of the kind of society they enforce. A good example of this is the recent kidnapping and murder of Sarah Everard in London when she walked home recently. The man who was arrested for this murder was a member of British elite police force. And here in the United States, as Andy talked about at the opening of this show, we recently experienced the mass murder at 3 massage parlors in Atlanta, Georgia, carried out by a gunman who told the police that he was motivated by the desire to eliminate sexual temptation. Not only did this strike terror in the hearts of Asians across this country, who've experienced an escalation of violence and bigotry in recent years, but this echoed and concentrated a view of women that is taught in the Christian fascist churches in this country, including the church this alleged gunman attended, that it is up to women to be pure, that sex is a sin, that women are temptations. This needs to go. Now, none of this is human nature. It's not in the nature of men to view women in this way, to prey on them, to control them, to brutalize them. But it is in the nature of the system we live under, capitalism, imperialism, to fuel and reinforce this violent rage against women. All the more so as this system, with its drive to chase profit all over the world, rips up and ravages traditional ways of life, including traditional forms of patriarchy, breaking down the old structures. And as women and differently gendered people have struggled for a different place in society, all of this has fueled a revenge, a violent revenge, against women and differently gendered people perceived to have gotten out of their place. Now, ending all of this, breaking these chains, is a central part of why we need a revolution and what this revolution aims to accomplish. It's why point number 2 in the 6 points of attention of the Revolution Clubs reads as follows. We fight for a world where all the chains are broken. Women, men, and differently gendered people are equals and comrades. We do not tolerate physically or verbally abusing women or treating them as sex objects, nor do we tolerate insults or, quote, jokes about people's gender or sexual orientation. That's the world we're fighting for, and that's how we are living today and what we propagate now. Now, in line with this, there's a song that came out last year and spread all over the world that we found very inspiring, that we wanted to share with you and close out our show with. It is a song that is a defiant cry against femicide, and it's a song that strengthens our determination to end it. It's become known as a song without fear, with lyrics like, they planted fear, but we grew wings. And one of the things that particularly moved me about this song is its rejection of the totally puny individualist outlook of just looking out for yourself to avoid this horror. This song sings in part, I am Claudia, I am Esther, I am Teresa and Ingrid and Fabiola and Valeria, saying, I am these women, naming the women who've been killed. They are me, they are us. This is our fight. And this is a stand we embrace here on the Revolution Nothing Less show and in this movement for revolution. We are fighting for all of these women. They are us. We are fighting for a world worthy of them and all of humanity. That's a big part of what this revolution is about. So I want to sign off tonight on behalf of myself and Andy Zee. We'll see you next week on Thursday as usual. And with that, let me leave you with this. Canción sin miedo, a song without fear by Vivir Quintana.